Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Coburn, and today's episode we're going to be looking at Dorial Green-Beckham Jr., specifically talking about his data when it comes to his production, athleticism, all that kind of stuff. And just get to the point, maybe just to get to the point here with him is, he's been on two teams already, but it shouldn't be surprising that this is the case based on his data. And I think that there's a lot of people who have to realize that you can't put all your stock into one thing. Beckham is definitely a guy who has height and weight and length and all that kind of stuff, but he doesn't have the sort of traits on paper that you need to be an elite wide receiver. And as far as people comparing him to all these different kind of guys, which we'll get into, but he just doesn't have the types of traits that elite wide receivers with his particular talents had. And it shouldn't be surprising that he's had so much, or at least kind of a lack of success up to this point in terms of being able to stay on a football team. So we'll get into we'll get into passing yardage, market share, production, which is essentially a data point where you take the individual defensive statistic of passing yardage and you divide it by the team statistic. So in this case, if Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. had 1,000 yards of passing yardage, you divide it by the team total, which say is 4,000, then that wide receiver or Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. had 25% passing yardage, market share, production. You take that number, you compare it to every single wide receiver since the 1969 NFL draft class, and then boom, you have sort of a statistical model when it comes to him. Then, of course, we're going to look at athleticism. Athleticism I measure in three different parts: explosiveness, speed, and flexibility. Explosiveness takes the vertical and the broad jump measured against mass density, which mass density is weight divided by height. The speed score, which is the 40-yard dash measured against mass density, and then flexibility is the short shell and three cone measured against mass density. So those are all the marks that we're going to be looking at when it comes to Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. We're also going to talk about some of the players that have been compared to him, some of the sort of like people saying, oh, he's just like this guy type of thing, which again, we'll get into that, but I think people need to realize that Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. is a very risky prospect, always has been a really risky prospect, and not a ton of upside based on his sort of indicators. But ultimately, we'll get into that when we get to that point. So first off, let's start with his production and his athleticism. So starting out with Dorial Green-Beckham Jr.'s production, his passing yardage, market share, production score was a 57.25 out of 100 coming out of college. And based on this data, the majority of long-term starting wide receivers has been 58. That's the threshold for bottom end, just long-term starters, not Pro Bowlers, not all-pro players, not even five-time all-pro players. Just starters is 58 out of 100. So from the get-go, Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. did not hit starter threshold for wide receivers. And the only guys who fell below 58, just to get this out of the way, were wide receivers that never played the position in college, or like guys like Julian Edelman, for example, is one example of a guy who became a long-term starter who had below 58, but he was a quarterback at Kent State. Antoine Randall was also a quarterback versus a wide receiver, and he was another guy who didn't quite hit the 58 threshold. So for guys who actually played wide receiver in college since 1969, there hasn't been one of those guys who didn't hit 58 or higher who didn't have that good of a production threshold. So that's just an issue. It's just an issue when you have a wide receiver like him, like Dorial Green-Beckham Jr., who not only doesn't hit. And again, people who were talking about Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. at the time were talking about his physical ability and how, he has the potential to be an elite wide receiver, an all-pro wide receiver, a Pro Bowl wide receiver, all that kind of stuff. But if you don't hit the production marks of a guy that's a 5-time All-Pro guy, of a guy that's a 3-time All-Pro guy, of a guy that's even a 3-time Pro Bowl player. If you don't hit the production marks of those guys, and not even like off by a little bit, it wasn't like he had a 67.5, you know, he wasn't off by 0.5 points. He was a 57.25 out of 100 coming out of that spot. And I do understand that there are going to be people who are going to go, well, you know, he got kicked out of school because of the character stuff, and you know, he was going to one college and then he went to Oklahoma, and then he had to wait and he didn't play at Oklahoma because of all those sort of issues. But you don't think there was guys kind of like that? I mean, this is every single wide receiver since 1969. 1969. This is decades worth of wide receivers, and there hasn't been a single wide receiver to hit that production mark and become a multiple Pro Bowl / All-Pro player. It just has not happened yet. So, again, for the critics, and also, again, there might be people saying, well, character is the reason why he failed. It wasn't because of production. Again, character informs production a lot of times. If you are a guy who has lots of character concerns, and you can't see the football field because you're a knucklehead and you're getting into trouble, those guys show up on the data. Like, they show up here. You know, if you're a guy who didn't play a lot because you were missing football games because you were in trouble, you're definitely not going to have very good production as a result. And you're also not going to have very great production because you're not taking your football career seriously as much as doing stuff off the field. So, however you want to slice it with Dorial Green-Beckham, his production from the get-go was a major red flag, and something that you don't draft a guy like this day 2. I don't care who you are. You don't draft a player day 2 who has a 0% chance of becoming a 3-time Pro Bowl player, or even an All-Pro player for that matter, based on his production data. So this is just one of the biggest knocks possible on him, is his production. Which segues into his athleticism, in that he's not a terrible athlete. You know, he has an 86.51 explosive lower body strength score, a 94.51 speed score, and 86.88 flexibility score. And all those marks hit the minimum thresholds for an All-Pro Pro Bowl player. But this is why athleticism doesn't necessarily matter, because if you have a wide receiver who is this great athlete, like Dorial Green-Beckham Jr., who doesn't hit the production thresholds he needs to hit, right, nothing I can do about this guy. So I'm tired of people just saying, well, athleticism is the only thing that matters when it comes to wide receiver evaluation, and not looking at production and having that matter, because you should treat a lack of production as much as you should treat a guy who's a wide receiver who has below average production, you know, well, not below average production, but below average athleticism across the board. It amazes me that you have analysts who don't treat a lack of production the same way they would treat a lack of athleticism when it comes to their evaluation of guys. At least giving weight to that and putting that into consideration when you're trying to value this guy. Because again, this is Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. This is a guy that some analysts were putting above guys like Amari Cooper, above guys like Kevin White, and in many cases we're still putting him as a top 5 wide receiver in their rankings, despite these clear issues with production that he had coming out of college. So this is just the disconnect that continues to happen. Where people just look at athleticism traits, they look at size traits, and they think that that's the only thing that matters. All that matters is size and that. When, yeah, size, you do need to have some size, you do need to have some athleticism, but you also have to have production, you know, consistently. You have to have all those traits in one. And if you don't have one of those traits, if you have the size and you have the athleticism, but you don't have the production, you have a Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. And ultimately, that's just not what you're trying to look for. That's not a day 2 pick. That's not something you should invest a ton of stuff in, on top of his other character stuff, which, you know, I'm not going to speak too much on his character issues, but for a guy that had all those character issues, there just wasn't a lot on paper to say, hey, draft this guy, he's going to be the next Randy Moss, which gets into the next point of if you're gonna draft character concerned players, draft the really productive ones. You know, all the time we have people who bring up, and let's just bring Randy Moss into this. You know, people going, well, he's just like Randy Moss. Randy Moss was a great athlete, and he had some character problems, and look how he became. But this is Randy Moss's production compared to Dorial Green-Beckham Jr.'s production. Randy Moss was an elite, productive wide receiver in college, and who also had elite athleticism coming out of college. And honestly, he doesn't really even compare to Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. when it comes to his athleticism, because just watch Randy Moss in college. That's all I got to say. There's a lot of rumors and speculation about just how athletic he was, but just watch him in college and you'll see a clear difference between the way that Randy Moss moves and the way that Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. moves. And it's not to say that Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. is a terrible athlete. It's just to say that there's a clear difference between Randy Moss as an athlete and Dorial Green-Beckham Jr. as an athlete. And the bottom line is Randy Moss, despite his character issues coming out, you know, with the domestic violence sort of incidents and, you know, other sort of stuff, he was an elite wide receiver in terms of production. Like, there was a lot of things indicating that, yeah, he's a guy who has some character flaws, but he at least is proving that he can produce as an elite wide receiver. You go to another guy like Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant was another player who had a bunch of character concerns coming out. You look at his production, elite. You look at Alshon Jeffrey, another guy where there was concerns about weight and all this other sort of stuff. You look at his production, elite. You look at, say, a different position entirely. Take defensive tackle. A guy like Warren Sapp, who coming out had a couple blemishes here and there with weed and stuff like that. And he ended up having, you know, great production overall compared to his sort of stuff. So, you know, I'm going to be getting more into character stuff when it comes to players, you know, in terms of what they may actually say about them. But the bottom line is when you're looking at character and you go, oh, this guy doesn't have great character, you need to look and see if they're actually producing like an elite player on the football field. Because I'm tired of people using character as an out, using character as a way to say, oh, well, even though he didn't produce, he's a great athlete, and that's all you need, when that isn't the case. You need to have production and you need to have athleticism. So in conclusion, my name is James Coburn. You can find my work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics, and if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I will talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.